Hello, and welcome to my Virtual SaaS Global Forum 2021 paper. We're going to be talking about SaaS Enterprise Guide, and it's to versions 8.3, which is the latest one. SaaS Studio will appear in part 2. The part 1 is just concentrating on SaaS Enterprise Guide. And as you'll see, there's a lot of information that I've had to fit into this presentation. I've been working with SaaS Enterprise Guide since 2001. And so I've followed its progress since version 1.1.1, which is the first version I used, until now. We'll start with the agenda. You can see there are various versions. I've given some subtitles for each one. Version 4.2 is a special one, which we'll concentrate on separately from version 4. And then down to the bottom to version 8. Enterprise Guide projects are collections of objects, where the object could be a program, it could be a log, could be an output, but it could also be a link to programs, logs, and outputs, and also to external documents. So you can use an Enterprise Guide project as a project desktop if you want. So you could have all the documentation linked onto the project file, as well as the programming items. The older SCG files were produced in versions 1 and 2, and they could be opened up to Enterprise Guide 4.1. And then EGP project files, which appear from version 3 onwards, can be opened by later versions. The interesting part, or the annoying part, if you want, is that when you open an Enterprise Guide project file and then save it, it saves it in the format of that version. And you cannot open that project file with a previous version, which means you need to be careful about the the Enterprise Guide versions, so that you can still open project files if you're working in a team. All the Enterprise Guide versions should be the same across all the users of a particular project file. As I said, SCG projects were in version 1 and 2, and the code window was actually the same as Interactive SaaS. Now, the marketing department at SaaS decided to encourage users to make use of Enterprise Guide by saying you didn't have to do any programming, which is true. There are encapsulated tasks in Enterprise Guide, but my programming colleagues at the time Enterprise Guide first came out were extremely resistant to using Enterprise Guide because of that marketing. And they said it wasn't a proper programming environment at all. I took a different view, and I could do most of the programming that I needed to in Enterprise Guide. And because the code window was the same as the editor window in Interactive SaaS, there really was no difference in the programming style. The only difference being that Enterprise Guide couldn't actually run programs which created their own windows. It had to be done through Enterprise Guide itself. So you've seen a little character up in the top corner. I think it's probably a time to get him to do some work. So I created a little program at version 2 of Enterprise Guide, which allowed me to write a script. And so I will leave this slide to my friend PD.
Hi, I'm PD, the Microsoft agent, and I was included in SaaS Enterprise Guide version 1.0. SaaS Enterprise Guide was originally marketed as a replacement for SaaS Assist, allowing analysts to investigate data without programming, and storing the steps taken in SEG project files. Microsoft Agents Merlin or PD, that's me, used to recommend what should you use it. Version 1.0, created views of SAS datasets when subsetting with a query window. For small datasets this was very quick. But for large datasets it was extremely slow. And views of views were even slower. In version 1.2, querying was changed to create subsets in SAS datasets, which improved performance significantly. Although I was very annoying, Philip was sad when I was not included in version 2.0. Please enjoy the rest of his presentation.
I think he can go now. So we'll hide him. Off he goes. The program that I used for that was one that I wrote shortly after PD had been removed from Enterprise Guide. I was entertained by the fact that he would do whatever the programming control would allow it to do. And so I created a little program which allowed me to write scripts, which is what you've just seen. Version 2 came along without the Microsoft agents. But in version 1, there have been SAS supplied tasks which were encapsulated program generators. In version 2, users were allowed to write their own, which was a big step forward because there were gaps in the functionality of Enterprise Guide, and this allowed users to actually create their own versions, which, because they were user written, could be themed to match up their company's color schemes and general functionality. They were installed using an add-in manager or by just copying the DLL files, which were created by Visual Basic or C++ 6.0. And PD was actually written with a program written in Visual Basic 6.0. Now, version 2.0 was supplied with SAS version 8.2, but you had to pay for it. When it got to version 2.05, it was actually bundled with SAS version 9.0, and 2.1 was bundled, and the subsequent versions of Enterprise Guide were bundled with SAS versions. This hailed a change in the way that SAS had approached Enterprise Guide, and did give the impression it was primarily aiming Enterprise Guide as the user interface for SAS for future versions. It did nothing, to be honest, to encourage some of the programmers to move towards it, because the marketing was still saying, you can use SAS, but we've bundled the programs for you to use. Now, version 3, it was still in SAS 9.1.3, but it had been redeveloped using Microsoft.NET. And so you could create custom tasks in Visual Basic.NET or C#.NET. In Enterprise Guide, program nodes could also be converted to a stored process. Now, in version 9, there were various servers which were attached, which could be attached to a SAS installation. And one of them was a stored process server, which allowed access to SAS via a web page. An Enterprise Guide could be used to develop those stored processes. It could also generate a Visual Basic script file, VBS, that was scheduled as a Windows scheduled task to run a whole EGP project file. And the VBS script could also be run manually to run that project when needed. In previous versions of Enterprise Guide, the selected items could be run in the project designer. And if you didn't select any, it would run all of the nodes or the items on the screen that you can see from top left to bottom right where they're executable. But in Enterprise Guide version 4.1, you could actually link the items together using little arrows, which you can see. And so it would then flow in a logical manner, which the user could control. And so you could then run from an item to subsequent items which are connected, or you could just select all of them and run it all, but they would run in a specific order, which was very useful. Extra features were added to this in later versions. The custom tasks were still using .NET, but also it allowed programs other than Visual Basic and C# to create these add-ins, and provided they were using the .NET interfaces. And this was introduced in version 4.1. And one of the programs, custom tasks that I produced was a floating window data viewer, which effectively copied a SAS dataset into a Microsoft data grid, and then effectively took a snapshot of the data, and then multiple copies could be then extracted and compared side by side by just moving them around on the screen so they lined up. Or alternatively, you could look at completely different data sets and then compare the values in the two side by side. I said at the beginning I was going to explain why I'd selected 4.2, and the subtitle does explain it a little bit. In version 4.2, the editor, which had previously been exactly the same as the editor for interactive SAS, was separated from the SAS development because the enhanced editor had been frozen. And so it started adding its new features over time. There's another small advance, which was in the process flows, where there was introduction of conditional processing. These were little gates, I suppose you could call them, that would allow tasks to be run through them, but only if a particular condition was met. And so it would test macro variables or whether particular data sets existed. In SAS version 4.3, there were some extra features added to the editing, which allowed the code window to include prompts and syntax help, and also code complete. So you start typing and it would give you a choice of keywords that would fit that facility. You can see here that autocomplete on second character means that when you type 2 characters of a word, it would then suggest. So if you had DA, it would suggest data, but it would also alphabetically give you a list of statements after that. And then you could arrange your code, and you could say which particular parameters you wanted to autocomplete. This would also include libres and SAS dataset names that it knew about. And that's important to understand. It has to know about them beforehand before it knows what to do. There was also the ability to take a piece of code, which may or may not have been spaghetti code, and reanalyze it so that it breaks the code up into steps and then links them together. So you can see how the data flows through the program. This would give you an indication of whether there are any steps that were processing but had no value to the final product. Version 5 came along and 64-bit processing was introduced for Enterprise Guide. This didn't affect the way that you connected to SAS versions. So the servers and local versions could be either 32-bit or 64-bit. The link didn't care. But being 64-bit, you were making better use of the facilities on your Windows PC. And so it could have been quicker. It was a bit difficult to compare one with the other because generally you only had either 32-bit or 64-bit versions of Enterprise Guide installed. Now, there was also a data explorer. Beforehand, you'd gone into libraries and opened a data set, and it would add that data set to the project file. The Data Explorer allowed you to look into SAS datasets, but it would not automatically add the SAS dataset to the project. This tool was updated in version 6.1, which you'll see next, so that datasets could be optionally added to the project. Another feature which was bringing it more up to date, Microsoft Data Access Components was a fundamental part of Enterprise Guide. It was only run on Windows. And so the import and export wizards, which had been in existence since the beginning of Enterprise Guide, had been able to read XLS Excel files for some time. But the new version, in version 5, allowed SAS to export to XLSX files, the new version, which proved to be useful. And it also meant that you didn't have to use SAS Access or even license SAS Access to be able to read external spreadsheet files into the SAS, because it would process it using data components and then pass a converted SAS dataset into the server or local SAS installation. Every program in Enterprise Guide creates a log and an output, and these files were automatically saved in Enterprise Guide project files. In 6.1, a log summary tool was introduced to analyze the logs. It was a wonderful program. However, it had a big problem, or rather it had a problem with big files. There was no control over when the analysis was done. And so by default, the last SAS log that was opened when the project was saved was reanalyzed when the project was reopened. This, to me, was its Achilles heel, as closing a project with a very large log open, which you had analyzed already, would be reanalyzed when you reopen the project, which effectively locked the project until it was completed. And I found the only way to avoid this was to deliberately open a very small log file before I saved the project. And then it would reanalyze that, and it didn't make any difference in time. So, down so you can see. 7.1 introduced an updated log summary. I don't know whether that had anything to do with me moaning for the entire time 6.1 had been around. But I'd like to think it was me, but I suspect other people would complain too. And it came with a checkbox, which allowed you to switch it off in the options. So you could then switch it on when you needed to use it, but by default, it would be switched off if you switched it off there. Another useful feature was program history, which used an interface to Git repositories, which local repositories, that is, which would retain the program development history. This was fine, only relied on the program still being in the project rather than links to external files. So you couldn't get a history of a linked program in a project, only a project resident program. However, my favorite new feature was the ability to integrate file comparison tools. So SAS itself didn't have a tool, Enterprise Guide didn't, as a result, but it allowed you to link programs like WinMerge to compare SAS programs, which was extremely useful if you were making changes or you had two programs which you thought were probably the same, to see where they were different, if at all. All right, this is the bit that got people really hot under the collar when they were in corporate maintenance teams. Now, you remember I said that SAS Enterprise Guide would only allow the version that the project was created to open that project, or a later one. But when you opened it with a later one and saved it, it saved it in that version, and so previous versions couldn't open it at all. In 7.1.1, the SAS Enterprise Guide Updater was introduced, which meant that users could update their Enterprise Guide projects, Enterprise Guide installations, without having to download files in advance. And so it would do all the downloading and installing in one go. The problem, of course, was this version control. But also some corporate maintenance teams were a little bit protective of their installations, understandably. You wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same version, if at all possible, because of this incompatibility of later project files. However, SAS realized this and they installed a configuration switch, which would disable this feature, so that when it was installed from a corporate maintenance perspective, you could switch this off to stop the users messing around with the versions. SAS Studio tasks, now that SAS Studio was around, could also be shared in Enterprise Guide from 7.1. And this was from a single user edition of SAS Studio, which was installed on the same PC. So in other words, when you installed Enterprise Guide for your local SAS installation, then it allowed SAS Studio and Enterprise Guide to share tasks, or rather Enterprise Guide could share SAS Studio tasks. And a lot of them were more useful in SAS Studio, because particularly for the graph add-ins, in Enterprise Guide, they're all based on SAS Graph. But on SAS Studio, they're all based on ODS graphics. And so you got better quality graphics from the SAS Studio tasks. And they were pretty much the same functionality other than that. The ability to look at the remote installations of SAS Studio was added in Enterprise Guide 7.11. And then still in version 7, but even later, SAS 7.1.3 added an interface to the data step debugger. Now remember that I said that any SAS program that generated a window couldn't be run in Enterprise Guide. That was true of the debugger as well. But this was actually incorporated into Enterprise Guide, and so it had windows very similar to that seen in interactive SAS, but it worked in Enterprise Guide. Finally, version 8, which we're on at the moment, it became a lot more like a standard IDE like Visual Studio or Eclipse. And so it came with a front page, which allowed you to pick your projects, create a new project, and also it gave links to learning resources as well. And then, this round, remember I said in 4.1 that there were enhancements. This is an enhancement. So instead of running from a selected item, you could run to a selected item. So here we've got an item that's been highlighted. If I was to select run to item, it would run these steps prior to it first to make sure it's set up correctly. The Code editor also was updated so that you could select text and change it to lowercase or to uppercase with different control key settings. And also in the server window, table and column names could be dragged into the programs. There are also improvements to the general appearance. Now, in the past, Enterprise Guide had been in this vertical split or horizontal split, but now it allowed tabs within each window and also a 1 to 2 split, which is vertical or horizontal, which gave a lot more facilities for spreading your work out across the screen. It also allowed some of the windows to be undocked so it would float, a bit like my custom task that I produced some time earlier. And there was an optional dark theme, which I frankly have never used. I've never found the need to turn everything black with white text or colored text. White background is fine for me. And finally, we get to version 8.3, which appears to be only a maintenance release, so there are only bug fixes in 8.3. So, in summary, anyone looking for an IDE has probably not found it yet in Enterprise Guide. I mean, it's now 21 years old, but it's getting closer and closer. And there are features that approximate to the functionality in the other IDEs. Now, having used Enterprise Guide since its introduction, I no longer use interactive SAS very often at all. And I find the editing features to be far superior to those I used in interactive SAS, particularly now that since 4.2, the editor has moved on from that it inherited from interactive SAS for version 4.1 and before. And because of that, I'm wondering why the SAS marketing department decided to position Enterprise Guide primarily as a programming environment for non-programmers. I think that would have meant, if they changed their view back at the beginning, that we'd have a lot more programmers using Enterprise Guide. Okay, now I've talked about Enterprise Guide, and the paper has more information about SAS Studio and the comparison when ready. So this is my contact information, and I'll be able to talk to you after the presentation has been aired. Thank you very much.